Now we're going to look at a few examples so you can get the hang of the rules. So let's start with our old friend A1. So what does that look like in standard form? Well, the conclusion is a universal affirmative, so that's all S is P. And that means the first figure means that the M's go here. The major term goes up here in the major premise. The minor term goes in the minor premise. Here we have our copulative verb. And because these are universals, we're going to have all. So the argument turns out to be all M is P, all S is M, therefore all S is P. So now we want to activate our step 0. So here's our empty schema. Notice that we have the overlapping circles. The minor term is up here, the major term is here, the middle term hanging down below. So once we've started with our empty schema, the first thing we want to do with the diagram is put shading on. So now let's have a look at this. We're going to shade for any universals in the premises, and there are two. The major premise and the minor premise are both universal. So it doesn't really matter which one you start with because we're going to do all the shading before we move on to anything else. So let's start with the major premise. So think about this for a minute. What does that major premise look like when it's just by itself? So it's crudely here, it's our two circles showing the relationship between M and P. And what would the shading look like? Well, you know this from our examination of categorical propositions. The region of M outside of P is shaded. So basically what we want to do is superimpose this diagram of the relationship between M and P on the whole empty schema for the syllogism. So how would we do that? We would shade the region of M outside of P, ignoring the S circle. Why do we ignore the S circle? Because S doesn't have anything to do with the relationship between M and P. That's just between M and P, right? So when we're doing shading for two terms, as we did here, we're going to shade the region of M outside of P, but we're going to ignore the S circle. If you do a diagram and you're shading and you end up shading a single region, then the odds are you are including information that isn't in the original proposition. So how would we know, for instance, that the region of M that's outside of P and outside of S needed to be shaded without having that explicitly stated? So what we're really doing here is we're diagramming information that's explicitly stated, that is the relationship between M and P. In the same way, we're going to do the relationship between S and M. So what does that look like? So it's S and M. The relationship between S and M means we're going to shade the region of S outside of M. So there's our shading. So this is just like this diagram for a single categorical proposition that had S as the subject term and M as the predicate term, right? So now what we want to do is superimpose this information on the diagram for the categorical proposition. And so the way we do that is to shade the region of S outside of M, ignoring the P circle. So notice I'm shading all of this region of S outside of M to illustrate that all S's have to be M's. Now notice this region of S that's overlapping with M right here, this region, that's already been shaded. So that has nothing to do, though, with the relationship between S and M, because that shading came from the relationship between M and P, right? So again, we're diagramming the information that we have explicitly stated in the minor premise, which is the relationship between S and M. All right, so now have a look at this diagram. We have the shading done for the major and the minor premises, so we shouldn't add any new information to this diagram that comes from the conclusion. So once the diagram is complete with respect to the information in the premises, we stop putting marks on it, and now it's time to make the assessment. So what does validity mean? It means if the premises were true, the conclusion could not be false. So let's have a look here. If the premises were true, then the diagram that we constructed reflects all the relationships between S, P, and M that are explicitly stated in the premises. So speaking informally, we can say that these relationships are true. They're reflected on the diagram. So if they're true, then what does that mean about the conclusion? Does it have to be true? And the answer is yes, it has to be true. But look at why. Because of the shading, there is no other region of S left except the region of S right here that is completely inside the P circle. So what that means is that because we're assuming that the premises are true when we put marks on this diagram, if the premises were true, the conclusion cannot be false. And this diagram shows that because the only region of S that's left unshaded is a region of S that has to fall inside of P. So if these premises were true, then the diagram proves that the conclusion cannot be false, and this argument is valid.